shows the trend, and that's expected to continue over the next decade. With that, we'll dive into specifically the surcharge topic, just to make sure we're defining what a surcharge is. A surcharge is a fee that's being added on to a payment that's being made by credit card. It's commonly confused in the industry, the terminology, surcharge, convenience fees, service fees, and so on. We'll show the differences between a surcharge and a convenience fee on a later slide, but just so we're all clear what a surcharge is, it's adding an additional fee to a payment when somebody's making a payment by credit card. So what happened? A little bit of history. Back in January of last year, the card networks, Visa and MasterCard specifically, updated their operating rules, which now gave merchants the ability to assess surcharges. Prior to that, the operating rules, Visa and MasterCard said you weren't allowed to do that. And that was a result of a lawsuit that was filed 8 or 9 years ago, went back and forth, and they finally came to a proposed settlement. That initial lawsuit basically claimed that the issuing banks, as well as Visa and MasterCard, were basically fixing interchange fees in violation of antitrust law. So that's what the lawsuit was all about. And it was settled. Part of that settlement was, merchants can now surcharge. But if you are going to be surcharging, there are a lot of operating rules that you have to make sure you're following in order to implement surcharging. It's not just as simple as, okay, now we can tack on 3%, 3.5%, 4%, 2%, whatever it might be. There are a lot of requirements, some people might call them hoops to crawl through, hurdles to jump over, that will make it challenging for some businesses to actually implement surcharging. So why don't we dive into that? The first rule or requirement in order to implement surcharging is you can only surcharge credit card transactions. Everybody in the room here, everybody on the phone, if you are accepting credit cards, I can almost guarantee that you're accepting both credit cards and debit cards. You can only assess a surcharge on a credit card transaction. Debit cards, there are two forms of debit cards. There are PIN-based debit card transactions, which everybody in their personal life is familiar with. You go to the grocery store and they say credit or debit, and you say debit, and then they ask you to put your PIN number in. That's a PIN-based debit card transaction. You could also run that same card as a signature debit card transaction, where it's being run through the card networks, Visa, MasterCard networks, but it's being treated as a credit card transaction, even though it's a check card or a debit card. So those are two forms of debit cards, PIN-based debit and signature debit. You're not allowed to surcharge either one of those. So that probably raises the first question, well, how do you know? How do you know if the card type you're accepting is a credit card versus a debit card? If it's a face-to-face setting, most debit cards will say on the face of the card that it's a debit card. There are certain systems out there that can do what's called BIN recognition, where it'll actually recognize the type of card and tell the cashier or whoever is processing that payment what type of card it is. A little bit more challenging in a card not present environment. Again, it would require the systems to have the capability of actually recognizing that card, so you're not surcharging a debit card. And you might think, well, this is an issue on the consumer side in retail stores and restaurants and so on. If you haven't looked at your monthly merchant services statements, if you take a look, I can almost guarantee that you're going to see a lot of business debit cards on those statements as well. Businesses have debit cards, and it's coming right out of their business checking account. You're not allowed to surcharge those business debit card transactions either. So it can be a little challenging to make sure that you have the systems in place that can recognize those types of cards, so you're not surcharging the wrong type of card and possibly violating the operating rules. So that's the first thing to be aware of, to be concerned about, I guess. Reach out to your IT folks, your payment gateway providers, your ERP system providers, and if you're looking at surcharging, they need to have that capability so you can make sure you're following the network operating rules. Merchants will be able to surcharge either at the brand level or the product level. Most of you who were in the session yesterday probably saw similar information. Brand level would be at the Visa, the MasterCard, the Discover level. The product level is the specific card type within one of those brands. Within Visa, you have consumer cards, rewards cards, there are world cards, business purchasing, corporate, fleet, and so on. Those are all different product types. Each of those product types have different fees, different interchange rates. So if you wanted to, you could have a varying surcharge amount based on that card type to make sure you're covering your costs for the higher priced cards and maybe not charging as high of a surcharge for the lower cost cards. But again, that raises the next question: how do you know? How do you know if the card you're accepting is a purchasing card versus a business versus a rewards versus a regular consumer card? Same challenges there as you would see on the debit card side, the credit versus debit card. How much can you surcharge? You can surcharge your effective rate up to 4%. So what does that mean? Reaching out to Visa and MasterCard, they'll let you include transactional-based costs when calculating that effective rate. The transactional-based costs include interchange. Interchange is the amount that's collected by your credit card processor, but it's actually paid onto the issuing bank, to the credit card company, the Citibanks, the Capital Ones, Bank of America, all your major credit card issuers. That makes up 80 to 90% roughly of the total cost of processing a transaction. So that's a transactional-based cost. There are also network fees, assessments if you're looking at your monthly merchant services statements. Those are collected by your processor, passed on or paid to the actual card brands, Visa, MasterCard, Discover. And then your credit card processor is going to have transactional-based fees, a discount rate, an authorization fee, a per transaction fee. Any per transaction fee can be included as you calculate that effective rate. Things that you wouldn't be able to include would be, for example, if you're using credit card machines, credit card terminals, and you're buying that equipment or you're paying a monthly rental or a monthly lease, those are not transactional-based costs, and you're not able to factor that into your effective rate. Visa and MasterCard, they don't specifically indicate in their operating rules what you should be calculating that effective rate on, or pardon me, how often you should be doing that. Verbally, they've communicated that you could take the preceding 1 month's worth of activity or the preceding 12 months worth of activity to calculate that effective rate. But they don't come out and say it. They also don't indicate how often you have to adjust that. So you have to adjust it on a monthly basis, annually, every 5 years. Yesterday, I think the comment was made, once or twice a year. There aren't any guidelines. There isn't any direction from the card networks. It's really up to you, you the merchant, the card acceptor, how often you're going to evaluate your effective rate. The caveat, or not necessarily a caveat, but the thing that the card networks can monitor is that you're not paying or you're not assessing a surcharge that's more than 4%. As long as you're under 4%, they have no way of knowing what your effective rate is, because it's proprietary information between you, the merchant, and your credit card processor. Those fees that are being paid, that's proprietary information. They can't track and monitor those fees. It's really between you and your processor. So if your effective rate is 2.4% and you had originally calculated at 2.8%, as long as you're under that 4% threshold, there's no way for the card networks to find that out. So there's some flexibility there for merchants who are looking at surcharging from an operating rules perspective, because they're not able to find out what those effective rates are. Now, merchants who are looking to surcharge, you can see the second bullet point there on the screen. You do have to register with the card networks and also with your credit card processor at least 30 days before you would start assessing that surcharge. So that does give them the ability, the card networks, to track and monitor those merchants who have decided to surcharge, so they can make sure that you're not assessing a fee that's more than 4%, and Visa is already sending out secret shoppers into the marketplace to see if those merchants who are surcharging are following the rules. But they have no way of knowing what your merchant's effective rate is. So some other requirements if you decide to surcharge. You have to obviously be upfront and notify your customers of your surcharge policy. So the rules, they were really created to really govern those business-to-consumer type payments. So as you look at these rules, just think of it in a Walmart setting or Target or a typical retail store, and it makes sense. It's always a little bit more challenging to try to apply these rules to the B2B space. But you'll have to notify your customers. So if you have a storefront, you have to have a sign posted on your door, on your window, indicating what your surcharge policy is. You also have to have that surcharge policy posted at your point of sale. So at your checkout counter, your will call counter, whatever it might be. You have to indicate what % surcharge you're going to be charging. You'll have to indicate that you're not going to be surcharging debit cards. If you're accepting payments only in a card not present environment, you have to verbally communicate that surcharge policy. If you're accepting payments online, you have to post that surcharge policy on the same page as the checkout screen or where the Visa, MasterCard logos would actually be posted. If you're just sending out invoices, you're supposed to indicate what your surcharge policy is on those invoices if that's the only way you're communicating to those customers. Moving on, in addition, not only do you have to verbally or post signs, visually post those policies, you also have to include that surcharge amount on the receipt that's being provided after that purchase is made. That receipt has to have a separate line item that indicates the surcharge amount. It has to be the same font size and the same font style as everything on the receipt. So you can't hide it in tiny print and just tack it on. You have to be upfront. You have to be transparent with what your surcharge policy is. That leads to maybe another challenge. Can the systems that you're using today, do they even have that capability to include that line item, that surcharge line item? The card networks, Visa and MasterCard, they actually require that surcharge amount to be passed as a separate line item, not only in the authorization file or the authorization attempt, but also in the settlement of that transaction. So that surcharge amount is an additional field of data that is now being passed. And then that leads to the question, well, what if my system doesn't have that capability? What if my gateway provider doesn't have that capability? From Vantive's perspective, our systems that connect to the card networks, we've updated our systems and we have that information available. But the only solution that we have today that we offer to our merchants to actually surcharge is we have one model of a credit card terminal that we've done the additional development to include that surcharge line item. A lot of companies here, a lot of you on the phone, you're using some type of integrated solution, whether it's a point-of-sale system, an ERP system, some type of payment gateway. Many of those payment gateway providers, they haven't taken the steps yet to upgrade their systems and code to the various processors to be able to pass that additional data that's required. So even if they wanted to surcharge, the systems may not have the capability to do it yet at this point. What we're seeing is that it's kind of a wait and see. Is there going to be a high demand for this before all these companies invest in the IT development costs to be able to upgrade their systems? Just to maybe put things in perspective, Vantive has about 400,000 direct merchants that we process for, and over 500,000 if you include our indirect relationships. Currently, we have just over 70 merchants who have actually registered to surcharge. And of those 70 that have registered, there are only 4 that are actually surcharging. So has it caught on yet? It's been a year and 2 months. It hasn't caught on yet. Well, now Vantive, we process for all industry types, from retail to B2B, e-commerce, you name it. In the retail setting, if you look at a Walmart, a Target, and a Kmart, who's going to be the first one to jump in the pool and start surcharging? Does somebody say, well, we're not going to, but if Walmart does that give us the opportunity to, or do we want to have a competitive advantage over that other company that started surcharging? Everybody, it appears, is kind of taking a wait-and-see type attitude, at least at this point. Now, I've run across many merchants who are surcharging, or they were surcharging before. They may have been doing it, but not in line with the operating rules. So of those 400,000 Vantive direct merchants, Are there others who might be surcharging? They very well could be, but they haven't registered with us. They haven't registered with the card networks to actually start surcharging. A couple other quick little bullet points there. You can't indicate that the surcharge is a Visa imposed or a MasterCard imposed surcharge. It's you, the merchant, that's imposing that surcharge if you decide to do so. You can't pass the buck, so to speak, to your customer. And if there's a refund or a credit transaction, you have to refund that surcharge amount. With that, before I jump to the next slide, for those folks here in the room, any questions thus far or comments?
These rules are coming from credit cards.
Correct. The comment was that the rules are coming from the credit card companies, from Visa and MasterCard. These are in their operating rules and regs.
Trying to make it as difficult as possible to do this.
Yeah, the comment was made. Clearly, they're trying to make it as difficult as possible, and you know, they're not going to admit to that, but we can probably come to some conclusions. It is what it is. There's hurdles to jump over, hoops to crawl through to really make it happen, and there's cost associated with being able to surcharge.
Are their fees going to go up?
Are the card network fees going to go up? Very well could be. Typically, if the card networks increase interchange fees, you'll see increases in interchange fees in either April or October. Those are typically the 2 months each year that they'll announce their network updates. And there are, on occasion, some of the card types, the interchange rates go down, but more likely than not, they'll continue to go up. That's been the trend over the last decade plus that I've been with Vantiv. Other comments or questions from here in the room?
Question, are there any penalties for not disclosing surcharges?
Sure. That's a great question. The question is, are there any penalties if you violate the rules? Is that,
yes.
Hang on just a quick second, and I have a slide that will address that. This slide here, can a merchant pick and choose how they will surcharge based on size of transaction, the customer or who the cardholder is, or the products being sold? In a retail setting, this makes a lot of sense, and it's very straightforward. You go into Walmart, and let's say Rude and I are both in line, and I have a T-shirt, and Rude is behind me, and he's got a shopping cart with a TV and CDs and videos and $2,500 worth of stuff. Is that cashier going to pick and choose who she's going to surcharge based on the products we're buying, based on who we are, or based on the size of that transaction? No, if Walmart decides to surcharge, they're going to surcharge both Rude and I, or they're not going to surcharge either one of us. They're not allowed to pick and choose. So you can see the answers there. Products being sold, it's a little bit different in the B2B world. You may have, you don't have all your activity coming through one store. You might have different product lines, different business units. You might only have one merchant account, but you might be processing those payments from those multiple lines of business through that one merchant account. Actually reached out to MasterCard with this specific scenario, and MasterCard says a merchant with multiple business units or divisions may opt to impose a surcharge on credit transactions at all, some, or none of its business units or divisions. So what does that mean? Maybe you have a commercial division and a wholesale division, and you have higher margins in that commercial division and lower margins in that wholesale division. Maybe you decide to pick and choose. I'm going to surcharge that wholesale division, but not that commercial division, because our margins don't support card acceptance in that wholesale side. Well, we have customers who want to pay that way. Well, let's surcharge in that wholesale division side to make sure we can accommodate those customers who want to pay by credit card, but we're going to be able to still make sure we're meeting our margin requirements. So there's always some gray area on the B2B side, because the rules, again, they were created to govern that business to consumer card activity. So if you violate the rules, what can happen? As I mentioned, if you register, Visa, MasterCard know you're imposing a surcharge. They can track, monitor, make sure you're following those rules. They can send out secret shoppers. If you violate a rule, the secret shopper might catch that, but more likely than not, if there's a violation, it's because one of your customers is actually going to contact their card issuer, their credit card company, and they're going to complain. they're going to say, hey, these guys are surcharging me and they shouldn't be, or they violated this rule if they're familiar with the rules. And what happens is the issuer will look at that complaint, and if it is a valid complaint and they do some investigating and they find out you are violating the rule, it'll come, that message will go from the issuing bank to the processor, to the credit card processor or acquirer, and then Vantiv or whoever the processor is will communicate to the merchant and say, hey, you're violating whatever rule it might be. The surcharge rules, you can see what the penalties might be. On the MasterCard side, that customer can charge back that transaction, and the standard chargeback fees would be applicable if you violate that rule. On the Visa side, the issuing bank would have to file a compliance case, and you can see that per case is $200 up to $600 per violation or per event. But then on top of that, if a merchant fails to become compliant after they've been notified, they can be fined up to $25,000 a month by MasterCard or up to $5,000 per month on the Visa side if that merchant continues to violate those operating rules. And then, of course, the card networks reserve the right to increase those fines. So if it continues on and on, they can bump those costs up. Those fines get paid or get assessed first to the processor, and of course the processor is going to pass those fines onto their merchants. Other questions here in the room? All right. This next slide really highlights some of the things that the folks yesterday were talking about. We've been talking about the network rules, the Visa and MasterCard's operating rules. There are currently 11 states that make it illegal or they prohibit surcharging. And there was some great discussion in one of the sessions yesterday on the specifics about the laws of those various states. And two of those states, Connecticut and New York, there's pretty much no way around it. You're not going to be able to surcharge based on how those laws are written and in what area of the law book those laws are actually published. The other 9 states, based on the individuals who were presenting yesterday, attorneys, they indicated that those laws are governing consumer-based transactions and not business-to-business transactions. What we're letting our merchants know, Vantiv's merchants know, is consult your legal counsel before you make decisions to surcharge, and if you're going to be doing business in any of those 11 states, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Florida, Kansas, Maine, Massachusetts, New York, Oklahoma, Texas, and Utah. Questions on that? Again, keep in mind that there's 2 different sides. If you break a law, the repercussions there are one thing. If you violate the operating rules, you're violating a contract. It's a breach of contract because accepting credit cards, you're agreeing to abide by the operating rules. The ramifications of breaking one versus the other are different, and you need to make sure you understand that before you start implementing surcharges. All right. This will be a tough slide for everyone to see. This just really kind of recaps merchants, what merchants should really consider as they're implementing surcharging. And this is, of course, from Visa's perspective, and it just asks the key questions. If I want to surcharge, what do I need to consider? Is surcharging permitted in my state? When can I begin? What can I surcharge? How much can I surcharge? What must I disclose to my customers? Again, we can make this presentation to anybody. I can email it out to anyone. So just let me know, and you'll be able to take a look at this slide in a little bit more detail. This next slide here really defines the difference between convenience fees and surcharges. I had an NACM member email me about 2 weeks ago, and they said that they're going to be implementing convenience fees. And I asked a few more questions because I anticipated that they were probably looking at implementing surcharging, but they called it convenience fees. And there is a distinct difference between convenience fees and surcharges. The definition that was given yesterday in the presentation was a little vague. Convenience fees are not fees that are being assessed to cover the cost of card acceptance. It's a fee that's being assessed because you're giving your customer the convenience of making a payment in an environment that's not your customary environment to accept payment. So if you're a retail store and now you want to give your customers the convenience of making a payment over the phone or online, you can assess a convenience fee. There are some specific rules to follow if you're going to be assessing a convenience fee. Number one, it can only be assessed in a card not present environment. You can't assess a convenience fee in a face-to-face environment because you're not offering any additional convenience to that customer. It has to be a flat or a fixed amount. It can't be a percentage of the transaction. It has to be assessed on all forms of payment. So not just the credit card payments, because keep in mind, it's not a fee that's being assessed to cover the cost of card acceptance. It's a fee that's being assessed because you're giving your customer the convenience of making a payment over the phone or via the internet. Obviously, it needs to be disclosed. It can be assessed on either credit cards or debit cards. There are special exceptions and so on for the government and higher education. The example I always like to give that paints a pretty good picture of what a convenience fee is if you're going to go to a baseball game and you go down to the ticket office at the stadium and you're going to buy a ticket. It's a $40 ticket. You're going to pay by cash or by check or by credit card, whatever it might be. You're going to pay $40 for that ticket. However, if you go online or if you call up that ticket office over the phone, are you going to pay $40? Of course not. They're going to charge you an additional convenience fee. It's going to be a flat fee, $8.50, $9, $10, whatever it might be. It's going to be a convenience fee. And if they accept more than one form of payment, if they accept credit cards, if they accept ACHs over the phone, checks by phone, whatever it might be, in order to be in line with the card network's guidelines, you have to assess that convenience fee on not only the credit card payments, but the check payments, the ACH, the wire, and so on. Because again, it's a fee that's being charged because they're given that convenience of making that non-face-to-face payment. Surcharges, what we already talked about. It can be assessed on a card not present or a card present transaction, and that fee is strictly being assessed on the credit card payment to help cover the costs of processing that payment. You can't assess it on debit cards, only credit cards, and of course you can assess a percentage. The card networks also specify that you can't assess both a convenience fee and a surcharge on the same payment. I think that comment was made yesterday as well. So a distinction between the two. Questions about that? The next slide here, and I'll ask Rude to kind of jump in here as well. There are different things that merchants are considering, should probably start considering in addition to just assessing a surcharge. Obviously, the cost of card acceptance can be significant. If you're paying 2 to 3 to 4%, those fees, they're climbing. Your activity is climbing. Your fees are climbing. So what are some pricing strategies to consider? Surcharges is one of them. As we've just talked about, from a network compliance perspective, it's going to be challenging for some merchants to be able to do that. The card networks, they do allow you to offer discounts. You can say, hey, here's my price, and I'll give you a 3% discount if you pay by cash or by check or by wire. Are you including that cost of card acceptance in your price of goods sold? In the B2B industries, because historically card acceptance has been such a small piece of the payments that are coming in, it really hasn't been factored in, but as that volume increases, it probably should be. That's what retailers and restaurants have been doing for years, for decades, with 80 to 90+% of their payments coming in by credit card. They know what their cost of accepting that payment is, and they factor it into their menu prices, their retail goods prices. And then buyer-seller agreements. Are you finding out how your customers are paying up front? Renee, I'll turn it over to you to maybe add anything that you like there.
Yeah, interesting. I think that fundamental to credit, most of us may have some retail-esque or wholesale face-to-face interaction at some level in our companies. But for the most part, I think our largest concern rests with companies pulling out a credit card and paying an open account balance of perhaps 5, 6, or we even see 7-digit transactions nowadays via credit card. And obviously a 3% fee on a 7-digit transaction is just almost unfathomable, but they actually are happening. And the card companies a few years ago really didn't start the business-to-business commercial card where we most often got into the game of credit cards was with the federal government. They started paying us with their purchasing cards, and then, of course, states and large businesses started paying that way. And then we went and we learned in the B2B sector to start accepting cards, and we didn't really know what we were doing. We were novices, and so we just started accepting cards the same way that Johnny's Barbershop did or Susie's Diner or whatever. And we really didn't do what we were supposed to do because we didn't know any different. Nobody told us any different. And the truth was, though, that when the federal government began to pay us, their primary objective was to make it easier for you, believe it or not. We got paid by the federal government years ago. It's just you didn't get paid by the federal government without having a purchase order string, and it might take you months to get your money. Really? I mean, but you got paid. You weren't really worried about getting paid. It was just, when am I going to get paid, and am I going to have the right purchase order, and did the sales guy get it, and did I include it, and et cetera, et cetera. Well, when the government began to pay you with that purchasing card, their intent was that you got paid tomorrow, and they didn't have to fool with purchase orders, and neither did you. They thought, wow, ABC Supply would be willing to pay a little premium for getting money tomorrow. And we continued business as normal because we treated the federal government as a pretty good credit customer, one to whom we perhaps given unlimited credit because they were going to pay us. So we give them 30-day terms or whatever, but we didn't really worry about them if they didn't pay us 120 days. I mean, we wanted our money, but we knew we were going to get paid. And we just kind of gave them a blank check, and as long as we got purchase orders, we'll sell to the federal government. But their intent was for you to have your money tomorrow. The problem was that the credit industry, Sharish, didn't change with the new model. And we continued to give money, credit, terms to the federal government, and we processed their credit card at 30, 60, 90, 120 days, whatever we were accustomed to doing for these customers. They used our money and our credit for days, and then they turned around and took all of our profit margin by giving us a credit card. And what we have to learn, to Matt's point here, is that we have to learn that credit still has to change with regard to open account payments. We have to learn that we have to dictate to the customer upfront how we intend to be paid, not just the terms on which we intend to be paid, i.e. net 30 or whatever. We have to say we're going to be net 30 via ACH or wire or cash. And if you're going to pull out a credit card, you just changed our buy-sell agreement. Number one. So I'm going to let Matt give you a very interesting comment here that we've learned just recently about the buy-sell agreement. The item number two is that if I agree to take that federal government or anyone else's purchasing card or business card, and I've agreed to sell to them in a buy-sell on terms basis via cash, and they pull out the credit card, I simply say, no, I'm sorry, I didn't agree to sell to you at 3% margin for you to pay me at 60 days with a credit card. So you've kind of changed the terms of our agreement. And therefore, we might be willing to accept your credit card, but here's how we have to do it. New game, new agreement. We're going to keep your card on file, and every time we create an invoice, we're going to debit your account. And we're going to have our money tomorrow. Let's say we have a $5,000 order, there's $1,000 worth of damaged goods, shortage. We can simply credit you back $1,000. The systems, the credit card systems work very, very well that way. So the net billing to them 30 days from now from their credit card company is going to be $4,000, the accurate amount. They haven't made a P&L adjustment. We really haven't made a P&L adjustment. We've handled that within the credit card refunds and exchanges. A very lucrative and simple process, actually, that's quite friendly to this because they've done it for many, many years. But we haven't changed our game. And I would simply present the case that credit has to begin to really change how we take credit cards. And forgive the expression, but if surcharging is really what you want to do, I would argue that you're pretty much deciding that you want to do it. Yes, it's great to use a tissue when you have a cold. You wipe your nose, and it feels better for a short time. But you didn't make the flu or the cold go away. And I would argue that surcharging is somewhat like using a Kleenex, in that you make the temporary problem go away, but you haven't solved the real issue, and that is that credit, we haven't learned how to process cards in the open payment environment. We fundamentally have to change some things that we're doing, and we don't have time today, but maybe another story later on would be good about that. But Matt, I think they'll be very interested in this next little rules revision here about the buy-sell agreement.
I was on a call with MasterCard about a month and a half ago, and talking about they're coming out with a commercial payment account, a new card product to basically replace checks. But throughout that conversation, the topic came up about buyer-seller agreements, and the individual from MasterCard indicated that that if there's a buyer-seller agreement in place, it's going to take precedence over the card network's operating rules. Question that a little bit. My VP of Sales was on a call with some other folks from MasterCard a couple weeks after that, and they disagreed with the first gentleman who said that. It just kind of strengthened our position that the card networks aren't real familiar with B2B activity. So I reached out to our compliance team. I actually just received a response yesterday morning and posed the scenario. So I'm a merchant. I negotiate with my customer up front. I find out their form of payment, and in my buyer-seller agreement, I specify that if I'm going to accept credit cards, payment is due on day 10. If payment is going to be made by check, payment is due on day 30. And if those terms are violated, there's an additional 3%. Pose that scenario to our compliance team, and they came back and said, yeah, that's not a problem, because you're not discriminating against, if you look on the screen, you're not discriminating against one card brand versus another card brand, one card issue versus another card issuer. But it would take merchants, card acceptors, to ask those questions up front. Well, how are you going to be paying, and factor that in to your terms and conditions of that buyer or seller agreement up front. And a little bit different than how things have been handled in the past, where you want to make a payment, okay, your terms are 30 days. We don't specify the form of payment. So it's quite interesting to hear that those buyer-seller agreements aren't violating the card operating rules.
Matt, along that line, I think by initiating a buyer-seller agreement with type of payment and outlining payment, it also allows that if you're going to accept that credit card and you're going to pay those fees and you get your money tomorrow, it basically says that now I am using the credit of the customer as opposed to the customer using the credit of you, the merchant. And you're willing to pay to use your customer's credit, but you want your money 10 days or tomorrow, whatever your deal is. And then what happens is the cost of credit cards are really, we can start to offset that by cost of capital as opposed to margin on sale. And that makes a critical difference. If you are using the other guy's money and you can, so to speak, lend that other part of your credit money to other people perhaps, then maybe it makes sense. But it is a fundamental change to how we do credit today and how we think about credit. But I would argue that as we really deal with the real sickness, if you will, of credit cards and the toughness of that, the tissue is not altogether the answer. There's a much, much bigger consideration in credit that we need to begin to adjust how we do things.
Just going to real quickly go over a couple of last slides here in the next couple minutes. So whether you decide to impose a surcharge or not, or you're looking at other ways to help manage that cost of card acceptance, there are some things you can do today without doing anything really new, and that's it's managing what's called interchange. Many of you in the room, and I'm sure a lot of you on the phone, are familiar with interchange. I mentioned this before. There are fees being collected by your processor. 2 of those 3 fees are being siphoned off to either the issuing banks or the card networks, and then your acquirer is keeping their processing fee. Interchange makes up the highest cost component of processing a transaction, which I mentioned before. It's collected by your processor, but it's paid on to the issuing bank. Typically 80 to 90, sometimes 95% of the total cost is made up of interchange. In this slide right here, you can see 85% of the total cost of this $500 Visa business-to-business transaction is made up of interchange. So if there's any way to control or manage that big piece of the pie, obviously that's going to kind of give you your biggest bang for the buck to help reduce costs. There are 3 different influences that impact the rates transactions are qualifying at. The type of business you're in, the processing technology you're using, and then of course the card type that you're actually accepting from your customer. Some of those interchange fees you can control, some of them you can't. As an example, if you accept a business card in a card not present environment and you include that address information, the interchange rate is 2.10 and 10 cents. However, if you don't include address information and level 2 data, there's an additional 85% fee or 0.85% fee or 0.85% downgrade associated with that transaction. You can control including that address information and that level 2 data. So when we're talking about systems and data and how that impacts the fees you're paying, this is just a quick example of the significant impact that those pieces of data have on that fee. Commercial cards have different requirements than consumer cards. Commercial cards require level 2 and or level 3 data to qualify at the best possible rate. If you're accepting commercial cards from your customers, which pretty much everybody on the phone or here in the room probably is, if you're not passing all the pieces of data that the card networks are requiring, you're going to be paying a higher fee or you're leaving money on the table. I've done hundreds, thousands of comparisons over the years, and there are many merchants today that still aren't passing the maximum amount of data. Level 3 data is line item detail, quantity, description, dollar amount. If that information is tied to the transaction, those transactions are going to qualify at a lower rate. This next slide here covers how one transaction could qualify at multiple interchange rates based on the systems that are being used and based on the data that's being passed with the transaction. This next slide here is a $500 transaction example. If you pass that maximum amount of data on those commercial card transactions, you can reduce your interchange fees by 29 or 34%. If it's a $50,000 transaction because of the reduced cost, the reduced interchange fees, it's cutting those fees by 45 or over 50% on those $50,000 plus transactions. This is an example of a business-to-business customer that processes $2.7 million a month. Recently had performed an analysis, and when they were not passing level 3 data, you could see their interchange expense, their effective rate was 1.97%. They upgraded and started passing level 3 data. You can see it reduced their interchange expense to 1.71, which amounts to $7,000 per month, over $80,000 annually. Now, not all the transactions are going to qualify at that best possible rate. Of that 2.7 million, only 766,000 of it was transactions that could qualify at that best possible or that reduced rate. But you can see that it does have a pretty significant impact. This same merchant had this is just one example that I had pulled from their statement, almost a $40,000 transaction. They qualified for that level 3 interchange rate. Had they not been passing that level 3 data, depending if it was a tax-exempt or a taxable transaction, you can see the fees that they would have been paying. So for that business, it's making a huge impact. So my encouragement to everyone on the phone or here in the room, if you're not passing level 3 data, it may be well worth your while to look into that and see if you have the capability to pass that level 3 information.
Just real quickly, one of the things that we hear very often is we're told back, my bank told me it was real hard to do level 3. It's real complicated. Maybe you could address that. Is it difficult?
It's not. It's definitely a misconception out there. For businesses, for example, in a card-not-present environment, they're accepting payments, on-account payments via a virtual terminal, for example. You can actually pass one general line item of detail with that transaction. A quantity description is C invoice or ABC supply company. Product code is 1234, dollar amount $1,500. You pass one general line item of detail, and Visa and MasterCard, they look to see if those level 3 data fields are populated. If they're populated, that transaction qualifies at the best possible rate. So even though you may have invoices with hundreds, if not thousands of line items of detail, the card networks only require one line item to qualify at that best possible rate.
So you could put one lot of one each roofing materials, $3,000.
Got it.
So the on-account payment scenario therefore qualifies as long as you fill in those fields?
You got it.
And out of your 400,000 direct merchants, what percentage of those merchants are passing level 3 data?
Oh, boy, I don't have an answer to that off the top of my head. I'd say it's 1%.
Really?
Wow. Yeah. Yep. It's probably very few. The majority of them are similar to everyone in this room and probably on the phone. They're NACM members. They're in the B2B industries, and they're passing that data.
But if it's only limited amount of data I've really got to pass, what makes it so difficult that other 99% is not doing it?
Well, for example, we process for Macy's. A lot of consumer-based activity. Passing that level 3 data on consumer cards, it doesn't get you a lower rate. So they've decided, well, it doesn't make sense for us to invest in the technology to pass that additional data because we're not going to see the cost justification to do it. And that goes for some B2B companies as well. You might be a B2B company, but maybe only 5% of your transactions are those cards. It may not be worth it, but in the example we saw.
That fee structure is based on the kind of card it is.
You got it.
So if it's a personal card, even though it's a B2B transaction, that level 3 processing doesn't get you.
You're correct. The comment there is if it's not one of those commercial card types, it's not going to benefit from that additional data.
That's like Rick in the example of that merchant, 2.7 million, but only 700,000 qualified for level 3. So probably have the personal card.
I gave you my personal
Right.
yes,
Right.
which is typically what's happening.
But what Matt and I see among the NACM collectively is that about 60% of your transactions today can qualify for level 3. That's kind of the benchmark that we see just on average working, maybe not so much for you because you guys have some retail-esque type business, but collectively across the NACM, we're seeing about 60% of the transactions could possibly qualify at level 3. And especially is this true when you got open account payments that are processing your cards, where you have collectors, credit personnel taking payments over the phone. Very, very critical, and it's really not too much to put in a few more keystrokes on those big dollar transactions. So that's where you can go back to the differentiation between transaction types and say it's worth it for me to do it over here on the open account. It's really not worth it for me to do it at the point of sale, for instance. Those types of things are possible.
With that, I know we're up against the time clock here, so with that, I really appreciate everybody's time, and I'll turn it back over to Drew.
Yeah, okay, so a couple of comments. I know for those of you on the phone and on the webinar, I see about at least 25 questions, some very relevant questions. There are questions about, American Express. There are questions about, your office location versus the branch sales location for states that qualify and don't qualify. There are questions about, we already had surcharges. How do you make them more compliant? So for all of you on the call, I think these are really good questions. I'm looking at Matt and Rodé in the room. We have your names. I know that I've been and my colleague has been responding to you electronically. We will get back to you with responses, within the next 24 hours. Several of you have also asked about, getting the deck. You're going to get that tomorrow. The only request I'd make is, as credit to be and as the institution that's driving all of this, we look for feedback. So as soon as you log out, you're going to get a quick survey. It should take you no more than 15 seconds of your time. if you could respond and tell us a little bit about the event and anything we could be doing better, we welcome your feedback.
May I have 1 second? Matt, you might want to say real quick about Amex and Discover. We didn't mention their position in this.
Sure. American Express and Discover, as it relates to surcharges, Discover is very, very similar to Visa and MasterCard. They actually do allow you to surcharge their Discover debit cards, where Visa and MasterCard don't. American Express actually settled a lawsuit back in December, very similar to Visa and MasterCard. They have yet to update their operating rules and regulations, so we don't know for certain if they're going to fall in line with Visa and MasterCard. We're anticipating that that's probably going to be the case. But you have to keep in mind that some of the specific rules of those card brands, if you're going to surcharge, for example, an American Express card, you're supposed to be surcharging the other card brands at the same amount. Typically, American Express is a little bit higher. So if you surcharge American Express 3% and you surcharge Visa and MasterCard 2.5%, you're actually then violating American Express's rules because they say you have to surcharge the other card brands at an equal amount. So make sure you're familiar with the operating rules of any of the card brands you're accepting. And there's probably more to come on the American Express side because that lawsuit was recently settled and they haven't updated their operating rules yet.
Great. One final comment, Matt. I'm also noticing that there's a lot of questions about the states that require and don't require, that allow and don't allow, sorry. So if maybe in the follow-up, if we could send out a comprehensive list for all 50 states, if you have something like that, I think it would be very helpful because I'm getting questions on Oklahoma and something else, and I think it just one list for the entire United States would just solve the problem.
Sure. How about if we take the questions and maybe just put them in a document and send that out to everyone, and then everybody's questions can be answered?
Perfect. We got one question that actually requested us to do exactly that.
All right, we'll do it.
We're going to do that for that person who asked the question. Actually, a couple of you. We will send out a Q&A with all the responses on it.
Awesome.
So with that, we're up on the hour. I just want to thank everybody for your time and look forward to your feedback. And again, thank you to Vantiv and thank you to United Transactions.